Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. The Names Not Numbers Oral History Film Documentary Project is remembering the stories of the Holocaust and is telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. This unique project is in its 16th year. Over 2,500 survivors and 6,000 students have participated in it worldwide. The students were instructed by teachers and professionals. They learned interviewing techniques from journalists. They learned filming techniques and editing skills from documentary filmmakers. The students interviewed, filmed, and edited the 2-hour interviews with each survivor to make 20-minute oral histories that are compiled in the Names Not Numbers documentary at the school. You're about to view the documentary Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. This film chronicles the students as they are being trained by the professionals and includes their reflections. In it is embedded approximately 10 minutes from each interview. This is the students' work. They're filmed and edited interviews. Through this project, our students are preserving history, and they are the witnesses to the witnesses.
Some woman came out and said, "There's a Jew, let's throw him on the fire."
Now it was not tolerable to live. We were all very scared.
I got the Mauthausen, the number of 68818. I was told, a little boy, this is going to be your name from now on.
Treblinka was not a concentration camp, it was a death camp.
I felt this just overwhelming feeling of abandonment.
Try to imagine losing everything, everyone you loved.
The project that we're doing is called Names Not Numbers. We are interviewing Holocaust survivors and making a movie to pass down all their stories.
Names Not Numbers is where the 8th grade interviews Holocaust survivors, and we make a documentary film about them that is usually presented at the end of the year. So we make the documentaries to remember their stories and they won't be forgotten.
We research and interview a survivor and we get to hear their story, and then we publish it and so we can keep their memory alive.
I will be honest with you, I thought there's no way we're doing Names Not Numbers this year. It's not just that you're connecting with the history of the world, first of all. Holocaust is one of the most significant events in modern history that changed the world. It's also your history, it's Jewish history. You're going to be learning things about your family, about your ancestors perhaps. But in addition to learning about history, you're also going to be making history. By participating in this project, you are going to capture the stories and the memories of these people firsthand. And you're going to be the ones, they want to sit down with you to make sure that your children, future generations, will know exactly what happened, will know how people responded, will understand the stories of the heroism that happened, of the tragedies that happened, and the way people found the strength to live on and to find hope. This is the most important project you're going to have now.
At the beginning, right when we were getting introduced, Rabbi Lindsay was the one talking to us. He said we're one of the last generations to be able to even do this project, which is very lucky, and we should feel very honored that we were able to do it this year, especially in these times of COVID.
I'd always watch the older kids do names, not numbers, and it was like finally our turn, and thank God we get to do it because it's not going to be around for much longer. This project is important to me because it's one of the things in my life that I will probably never get to do again.
Tova Rosenberg, who is like the head of Names and Numbers, spoke to us also on Zoom.
55 years after the end of the Holocaust, 31% of all Americans believe that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed in the Holocaust. The survivors and the students are telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. Our Names Not Numbers students are learning history, recording history, and preserving history through their work.
Mrs. Rosenberg told us that it's very important to interview the Holocaust survivors because a lot of people who aren't Jewish don't know much about the Holocaust, and we need to tell the stories of the Holocaust so everyone is educated about it.
I think there's a lot of reasons why it's important to learn about the Holocaust. First, soon other people won't be able to interview them, so it's important to pass down their story, show how strong the Jewish nation is, and that we will eventually overcome any struggles that we have.
So we all gathered in the auditorium and we watched actually a previous film, and it showed us kind of how to do it and what it might be like, and the emotions that might come with the interview.
This is an interview that was conducted at Yeshiva University, and they are interviewing a man named Dr. Moshe Avital. Dr. Moshe Avital, I'm sad to say, just passed away. And his interview is one of the most powerful interviews that I've ever seen. But it is a guide for us in terms of how we are going to have our interviews conducted and how we are going to train and work really hard to make sure we are educated before we go into the interview, that we write the best questions possible in order to elicit the best answers and the best stories and the most descriptive stories from our survivors.
My name is Moshe Avital. Under the surface, there was anti-Semitism, but they didn't show it really.
It was all very meaningful. I cried a little bit while watching that, and then it made me so very excited for what I was going to be doing.
I think my great-grandmother would be very proud to know that this is what I was doing. I wish I could have interviewed her.
Some of my family didn't make it throughout the Holocaust, but I find it really nice and moving now that I'm able to make a movie about what they went through, and I think it's going to be really interesting, and it's for the future generations, so they'll be able to hear about it and they'll be able to hear movies with lots of questions asked to the Holocaust survivors, so we have their whole stories, because I wasn't able to have that with my family.
It's really important to me, this project, because since I have such strong connections to people who really lived during the time of the Holocaust and sadly died, I have had thoughts thinking what they would think that I am doing Names Not Numbers this year, because I think they'd be very proud and just in awe that also all of the 8th grade is just helping remember these stories, and even though we're just so young, we can make such a big change.
We were on a Zoom with a journalist who introduced us how to interview and ask proper questions, the right way to ask them, the polite way to ask them.
We learned about how to ask questions and interview the survivors.
Before you meet that person, you want to find out, what do I want to get from this interview? If you knew that they were in the ghetto or they were in the concentration camp, what happens when the Nazis came and took you? Tell us about the ride to the concentration camp. Who were you with? What was the first thing that you felt or that you smelled when you came to the concentration camp? What was your feeling like? What was that first day like? What did you imagine was the future? These things are helping us understand the survivor and really, really get to the survivor's story and understand what they were going through. How did you maintain your connection to God during the war? I think is a very powerful question as well. Just know that what they're telling you is a gift, because you are passing along the history of the Jewish people and you are recording it for posterity. So the opportunity that you have is golden.
One thing that stood out to me that Shoshana Soroka said to us was that we should kind of like be gentle with the survivors and like give them time to like pour out their emotions and stuff, and if they cry and stuff like that.
Leading up to the interviews, we had many activities associating with the Holocaust, learning about the Holocaust. The first day we got our groups and we were all really excited, and we got to read the biography of our person, Martin Lowenberg.
Me and my group made questions to ask our survivor, but first we had to learn a little bit about him.
We did a lot of research about our person who survived the Holocaust. We used to do research on what he was like, where and how he was in the Holocaust and how he survived.
You heard a lot from the journalist about how important it is to be an educated interviewer. Let's say you're sitting in front of a survivor and the survivor says, I went to the Warsaw Ghetto. If you do not know about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, you may not ask your survivor if they were involved in it, if they saw what was happening, if they had anything to do with the uprising, and you might miss, right, some of the most important pieces of the story. So you need to be educated, you need to do research. After the research, we begin to write our interview questions.
We wanted to get as much knowledge as possible for the subject so we could be prepared to ask thoughtful and meaningful questions to the survivors.
When we got to Mrs. Hastings' house, we got to learn how to use the cameras.
Barak was teaching us about the cameras, about the volume, about how to zoom in and out, about how to move the cameras.
We learned about the rule of thirds and like how to zoom in and focus.
The first thing we're going to talk about is something called the rule of thirds. And that's something that's a rule that we use in art in general, and it could be in painting or photography, in filming. So what the rule is saying is, rather than filming straight ahead, okay, now I'm filming Ezra like a little bit off to the sides. So that's the way we're going to be filming.
Before, I've had some interest in like photography and stuff, but I never really pursued it, and this was the first time I was able to like see how all the equipment worked and stuff, and it was really cool and amazing that I got to use it for something so important.
Today, I'm going to be interviewing a survivor whose name is Martin Lowenberg, and I'm going to be asking him about his story and how he survived. I think that it being on Zoom might be a little bit harder, but it's still a great opportunity for us to be able to meet him.
Hello, my name is Ella Perlman. Thank you so much for joining us today to be interviewed for our Names Not Numbers project. I'm going to ask you some questions about your life before the war.
I'm going to be interviewing Izzy Stark.
I'm feeling excited about the interview. I got to finally meet a survivor and how interesting and a fun experience it is.
I'm feeling pretty nervous now because it's just I've never been in the presence of a Holocaust survivor before, and I just want to make sure that I portray the questions correctly, and I want to make sure I get as much of his story because it's such a rare opportunity.
Hi, how are you? Are you Hillel kids? All students in Hillel?
Yeah.
Nice.
Here, we're going to show you where you get to sit.
I am going to be interviewing Ben Goldwater.
I'm excited to be able to talk to someone who went through the Holocaust.
I'm feeling nervous but excited to get to be able to talk to a survivor because it's not something that everybody gets to do. I'm looking forward to hearing about how his father was a part of the Belgium underground.
Good afternoon. My name is Kobe Engel. Thank you for participating in our Names Not Numbers project. I am going to ask you some questions about your life before the war.
The survivor I'm going to be interviewing is Felix Weil. I'm excited, but I'm also a little bit nervous, and it's very exciting to meet a survivor and hear what they're going to say.
A question I'm looking forward to asking my survivor, Felix, is what motivated him to stay strong during the war? What was his inspiration?
We're about to film and have the interview with Sharon Pitluck Silver.
I'm a little nervous because I don't know how it's going to go, but I'm excited to hear her story.
My favorite part of Names Not Numbers so far was really when our survivor walked into the room that we were going to be interviewing him in, because everything had built up to that, and we were all ready. We had the camera tutorial, we had all our interview questions prepared, and then we were all standing at the door and he walked into the room and we all welcomed him, and it just felt like a really special moment.
My name is Felix Weil. I was born December the 12th, 1927, in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. My dad owned a wholesale textile firm. My mom didn't work. My older sister, she was 2.5 years older than I am. It was very comfortable. We had a beautiful home, and I had a lot of friends. I went to a public school until I was about 7 or 8. We belonged to a very prestigious congregation in Frankfurt called West End Synagogue. It was a huge congregation and highly respected. It certainly wasn't Orthodox, but it was between conservative and reform, you might say.
My name is Martin Lowenberg. The town that I was born in was Schenklengsfeld, January 21st, 1928. We were 7 siblings. My father was an officer in the German army from 1914 to 1920 until after the war. My father had they had their own business, which was produce for mostly feed for animals. And my mother was a housewife. Our instructions in Hebrew was mostly done at home, which was done by our mother. They were all pretty observant, and they tried to be together as much as possible.
My name is Ben Goldwater. I was born in Brussels, Belgium, on December 18, 1938. I have a sister, an older sister, who was 6.5 years older than I am. I had numerous aunts and uncles, numerous cousins, and I only knew my paternal grandfather and my paternal step-grandmother. Eisden was a little town in the northern part of the country where my parents, my sister, and I lived. My father, after his mother passed away, emigrated to Germany, where he lived with his paternal grandparents. And there he encountered the beginning of the German racial laws and also anti-Semitism.
My name is Sharon Pitluck Silver. I was born in a small village in Poland called Knishin in 1941. I was the first child. My parents were Shraga and Dvora Weinstein Pitluck. It was an agrarian community. Life was fairly simple and very uncomplicated. My father probably helped his older brother in making cheese for the village. The population of Knishin before the war was about 3,600 people. Of the 3,600 people, half of them were Jewish and the other half were Catholic. After the war was over, of the 1,800 Jews who were there at the beginning, there were 15 left alive.
My name is Israel Stark. I was born in the city of Munkach in the year of 1929. The majority of the population were Jews. We had a business at home which was kosher wine. My parents were also in the wine business. We had quite a big family, quite a few family members in the city of Munkach. There was almost every Shabbos we had one or two guests, which my father always was known that when he went to shul, and there were always some people who were either stranded in the city or for some reason couldn't get home. I was always looking forward, what kind of people is my father going to bring home this Shabbos from shul? I had to go attend public school, so I attended the Czech school. We were actually under the Czechoslovakian Republic up till 1940, and then we were reverted to the Hungarian, and we were occupied by the Hungarians.
We were subjected to anti-Semitism before the war, during the war, and after the war. It's something that was prevalent all over the world.
We faced anti-Semitism all along because we were growing up among Gentiles. They used to always bother the boys that went to Cheder and the boys that were pious.
There certainly was a lot of anti-Semitism even then. For example, most stores that were not owned by Jews had signs in their door and their windows, either saying no Jews permitted or Jews are not welcome.
Kristallnacht was on November the 9th of 1938.
Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass.
They broke the windows in the homes, they broke the windows at the synagogue, they burned the Sefer Torahs, they burned the synagogues.
I went to school on the next day, 10th of November 1938, and on my bicycle went past our synagogue, and the synagogue was on fire. It was the most beautiful, one of the most prestigious synagogues in all of Germany. And stopped there, and there were fires burning, and I distinctly remember to this day, some woman came out and said, "There's a Jew, let's throw him on the fire."
You could not even open up your window without receiving stones and rocks through the glass and sometimes into the faces of the people.
Things didn't start getting bad until 1935-36, when everything changed. We were no longer allowed to go to movie theaters, weren't allowed to own radios, weren't allowed to own bicycles, automobiles, of course. And then the public schools were no longer permitted for Jewish kids. I had a very good Gentile friend. And I used to get together with him every or most evenings after school when we would do either homework or play or whatever. And I will never forget one evening his dad came in screaming on top of his lungs, "Felix, what are you doing here? You're not permitted in our house. You have no business being here." And I was shocked. I had no idea what was going on. Left immediately, tears streaming down my face, and I talked to my dad when I got home, and he said, "Don't worry, it's not your fault, there's nothing you did that was bad, but the law had just been passed in the last couple of days that Jewish kids and Gentile kids will no longer be able to get together as friends or anything like that. And we were completely isolated. Dad had a very thriving textile business, wholesale textile business. He no longer was able to have his business. It was taken over by the Nazis.
We all had to stand up every morning, and we had to salute, and we also had to sing the German songs, but mainly we had to pay our allegiance to the teacher, to Hitler. While we were all standing there, the teacher started to accuse me that I had stuck out my tongue at Hitler's picture, which was hanging in front of the classroom. He immediately instructed other boys to beat me up, to punish me, and kick me and spat in my face for what apparently I did. And needless to say, I didn't, but after that incident, my parents would no longer send me to a public school. My parents had to make arrangements with a Jewish boarding school. And now it was not tolerable to live. We were all very scared. All of a sudden, we heard pounding on the door. My father naturally opened the door. He was arrested. So were all the men from the age of 16 up to the age of 60. They were sent to Buchenwald. Fortunately, my father was there for 4 weeks. In 1941, we received notice that to pack up everything that we have, and you have to go to the train station. The trains came, boxcars. We did not know where we were going, and we were traveling for 4 days and 4 nights. It was my father, mother, my sister Eva, the twins, and I. And we were cold, we were frozen. It was sub-freezing temperatures. And we arrived in the ghetto.
The Germans invaded Belgium on May 10th, 1940. I recall standing on the corner of our street and watching a German parade with a lot of martial music. My father took my mother, my sister, and I, and we fled to France. So by fleeing to France, they thought they had a safer haven. Unfortunately, the French didn't really accept refugees, and particularly not Jewish refugees. A lot of the French police themselves were involved in rounding up Jews that they mistreated, and also that they turned over to the Germans for shipment to Eastern work camp. So at that point, my parents decided to return to Belgium. And the 2 cars were loaded with, 1 car with my mother, my sister, and I. There wasn't enough room for my father or his friend, so they followed the car with bicycles. The Germans were flying over the roads and strafing and bombing anything they could. When Belgium, we went to a city called Mons in the southern part of Belgium. They thought that there was a level of safety there, plus the fact that my father was able to join the resistance where he could assist in the war effort and also protect his family.
They invaded Knishin. Unfortunately, I know the exact date. It was November 2nd, 1942. I said unfortunately because that also happened to be the day that I turned 1 year old. And it was the day that my parents were murdered. This woman explained she was looking out her window. She saw a lady walking down holding a baby, but what was strange is, you know, generally you hold a baby over your shoulder or cradled in your arms, and this woman was holding the baby down at her hip, sort of like you'd be holding a sack of groceries. And she thought it was sort of weird, so she went out to look. And she said as soon as she walked outside, she knew exactly what was happening, because at the end of the roadway there were a couple of German soldiers. So as she stood watching, she saw the woman stoop down and put the baby behind a bush, and then veer and go off in a whole different direction, very obviously hoping that the soldiers, if they were going to follow anyone, would follow her and leave me. She left me hidden behind a bush, hoping that the soldiers wouldn't see me, and that was her best hope of saving me. I don't know whether they followed her, but it was the last time I ever saw my mother. I was too young to be able to survive on my own at all. There were very few babies, children my age, that managed to survive. And of those that did, many were taken, like I was, to a Catholic family, but never found out that they actually had been born Jewish. My eyes are blue. My hair was always very light brown, and my skin is very fair. I do not look like Hitler's perception of what a Jewish person should look like. That probably saved my life more than on one occasion.
Beginning of 1940, when we occupied the Hungarians made a deal with the Germans that they are going to take away all our rights, all our privileges. We were still not moved from our homes till 1944. In 1944, around March or April, was when Hungary was occupied by Germany. And the minute that the Germans marched into Hungary, very shortly after that, maybe a week or two, they started getting busy to transport the Jews to Auschwitz. They took us away from home a day after Pesach. And early in the morning, they told us that we have 1 hour to pack whatever we can carry. They transported us to the ghetto, a temporary ghetto, which was a brick factory in the suburb of Munkacs. They marched us into the ghetto. We didn't have much to eat in the ghetto. As a little boy, I was really worried about our destiny, what is going to happen to us. But nevertheless, I did not express this to my parents. I did not cry, I was not sad. I said, whatever the Ribono Shel Olam has in store for us, we will just have to live with it.
For me, the Holocaust Museum trip was truly an amazing opportunity. And just seeing all the artifacts and hearing all those stories, it just made it all very real.
The Holocaust Museum was very meaningful and powerful to me because they showed a lot of artifacts that the Nazis took away from the Jews in the Holocaust. So we got to see them in person, and we also got to go into a boxcar train, and it was really powerful to see that because we literally saw what the Jews were in and how compact they were inside those cars, and I had never seen anything like it. I couldn't believe that they actually went through there.
When I stepped into that cattle car, it made it a lot more concrete for me, even though we have learned about it so much.
The most meaningful day was definitely the Holocaust Museum because I've never been there. In the sets of the concentration camps and like the gas chambers really showed me just how horrible it was and how important this is to record this history.
I was only 11 years old when I left my family, because I was on a Kindertransport and never saw my family again after August of 1939. It came very suddenly, and I was completely unaware, and I was told by my parents that it would only be a matter of a few weeks when they and my sister would join me in England. And this was a big adventure to go to a new country, learn a new language, and have everything different than what we had before, of course. And by the time I realized what was happening, the war had broken out, and it was then impossible for my parents to leave, and my sister. The age of the kids were between 2 and 16. The trip was a long trip. We went through Holland, and there's usually around 400 kids in the train. And as we left, the Nazis, the black uniform and brown shirts, came on the train and told us that we would never, ever be allowed to come back to Germany. And everybody yelled, hooray, and we're glad to leave. We don't want to come back anyway. And to this day, I'm surprised that they didn't shoot some of us or beat us up or whatever. But then we were met on the other side of the border, and it's like night and day, by these most wonderful Dutch people that gave us cakes and coffee and candy and what have you, and hugged us and kissed us, and they were the kindest people you could imagine. Then we crossed the English Channel. English Channel is always very rough, and everybody became seasick, and the older kids had to take care of the younger ones, and it worked out. Nobody dies from being seasick. First of all, it was a complete mistake that I was on. Somebody had made a mistake, and there was a girl by the name of Felicia, which is very similar to my name, Weil, and was supposed to have been on the train. Somehow the mistake was made. That's how I got to be. I shouldn't have even been on that train. If it hadn't been for that mistake, I wouldn't be here today telling you that story. When we arrived in London, and most of the kids were being taken in by friends, relatives, and family, I was the only kid left on the platform that no one came for. And you can imagine what kind of feeling I had. They had no place for me to go. So I wound up in a hostel, and it was an all-girls hostel. Eventually, they had to figure out what to do with me, but before that happened, the evacuation took place. All children in that age group were evacuated from London because they were afraid of the Blitz, which of course came, and they wanted the children to be out of London when the Blitz came.
The Latvian soldiers, all they yelled is, out, 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 fast, out. We could hardly move. We were so cold. We had to line up. We stood in knee-high snow. So we had to go for 5 miles until we came to the ghetto. And we got a small apartment with a kitchen and one big room, and all of us, we ate whatever we could find. Worse than dogs. Every morning, all day long. We had to shovel snow over 10 inches high, and we had to go into the city. There was no transportation. We had to walk for a few miles until we came to the city of Riga. We got 1 slice of bread per day, and then towards evening, we had a soup. 2 years we were living like this. After the ghetto, we were then transported in concentration camp Kaiserwald. Needless to say, we had to work every single day. From 4:30 in the morning, they got us up until about 1:30 or 2 o'clock the next morning, wherever we could find any scraps of food on the streets or wherever we were. We took it. I was in Kaiserwald for approximately about 2.5 years. Most of the people that were with us in Riga had either died of starvation or were killed. You only had mostly the younger people like myself. And of course, we were being used for hard labor. So it was a very, very hard way to live. December of 1944, we were working on the port of Riga, put on a ship, and of course they put us all the way down in the ship. It was wet, it was cold, and for several days now we were on the ship, and the destination apparently was Hamburg, Germany. And once we arrived, we got off. They put us in prison buildings and locked us up. We were there for several days. Foreign prisoners, convicts, literally convicts who had killed people. We were just trying to hide away from them so they wouldn't attack us. We were so thirsty and we were so hungry, and we were luckily we got a little bit of water, and then they took us marching, and we marched again. We marched at night, we marched during the day.
The first laws that we encountered is that all Jews were to wear the Star of David on their clothing. The Germans confiscated all motor vehicles. And secondly, they tried to confiscate all radios. We feared the neighbors, friends, acquaintances who would denounce us to the Germans as Jews. So the less conspicuous we were as Jews, the safer we were. I recall walking with my dad to an acquaintance of his that lived nearby. The door was open. And we walked into the kitchen, and there was food on the table that was still warm. And I walked into the boys' bedroom, and on each of their beds there was a violin. I looked at my father's face, and I will never forget the look on his face. It was a look of utter horror, because he knew then that this family had been taken by the Germans. My father took me aside, and he said to me rather sternly that I had to forget that my name is Benjamin. I had to forget that my name is Goldwasser. I had to forget that we were Jewish. I could tell no one because something terrible would happen. My father also told me that I was going to go and live in a neighboring village, to live with a woman that I didn't know. And I felt this just overwhelming feeling of abandonment. But my father promised me that he would bring my sister the next day, which he did. Josephine didn't take us in out of the goodness of her heart to spare the lives of 2 Jewish children. My father paid her for it. Josephine had prepared 2 rickety beds in an unfinished, unheated attic for us, where we stayed. Quite often we would hear sirens, and Josephine and Denise would run into a root cellar. My sister and I were left behind in the attic, and we could see German searchlights. We could hear German anti-aircraft artillery firing at them. We could sometimes see planes caught in the searchlights. And on occasion, we could see a plane in flames. I wasn't so frightened because I didn't understand what was happening, but my sister was frightened for both of us. She was protective for herself. I mean, my sister was barely 10 years old. and she was also protective of me, her little brother. We spent 14 months with Josephine and Denise. I received regular beatings from her. My sister and I were not fed, at least not very well. We were always hungry. My sister and I did not go outside. So my sister and I played various games, which included her teaching me how to read and write. My parents were hidden elsewhere, and the reason for our separation is that if my parents were caught, my sister and I might survive the war. My parents tried to come to see us on a monthly basis, but more often than not, Josephine would prevent our seeing our parents. My mother was able to get my sister alone, and my sister told her the conditions under which we lived. And so my father took us out of Josephine's house. He was able to obtain false identity papers. They were the identities of a Flemish family that had passed away. With false identity papers, he rented the equivalent of a 2-room townhome in a neighboring village of Mézières, and he moved us there. The underground used him because of his linguistic abilities. That's what my father did mostly. He also was used to smuggle messages and weapons in and out of the camp in Casteau. Sometimes he would take me along because it didn't appear as if he was doing any espionage work when he was with a small child. And he would meet with some of the Gestapo agents there, talk to them in German as if he was a native. And he was able to obtain information that was helpful not only to the resistance, but also to the Allied cause. My parents decided to separate us because if we were caught, my sister might survive. And so she was sent to a convent in another neighboring village called Aubure.
I know at one point they took me to the home of the priest. And the priest obviously was a very good man, and he said, I'm going to keep this child. And the townspeople said to him, you can't do that, Father. Priests don't have children. Ultimately, I was taken to the local police station. There was a man standing in the corner, and he came over and he held me. And then he looked at his friends and said, my wife Regina and I have been trying to have a family for a long time, and we haven't been able to. I'm going to take this baby and give her to Regina. Don't tell anyone I'm doing it. It was a family of 3. I had no clue they weren't my real parents. I became their beloved child. You know, this was a really small town. Everybody had to know. So I give them points for not turning me into the Nazis. Alicia, that's the name of the little girl that I was with all the time. We were sitting in the side yard playing, and a couple soldiers came up, and one of them picked her up and started to walk away with her. Well, the people in the house were keeping an eye out, and they came running out saying, what are you doing? Where are you taking our baby? And the soldier said, well, we heard you had a Jewish child here. And they said, what are you, crazy or something? And they got her baptism certificate, and they got her, this is her parents and her grandparents, and you know. And the soldier looked at her, said, oh, we must have been misinformed, and put this very dark-skinned, dark-eyed Catholic child right down next to the fair-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned Jewish child without ever suspicioning. I had definite memories of a man periodically climbing in my bedroom window sometime during the night. Was I frightened? Not after the first time, because this was a good guy. Why? Because he would bring me a piece of fruit, an apple or an orange. These were things that were almost impossible to get during the war. The man who came through the window bringing me fruit was really my uncle, Akiva, who became my dad. He was a resistance fighter. He was a forest person.
What happened to your uncle's family?
Treblinka was not a concentration camp, it was a death camp. They were put on the train to go, as was he. And he jumped off the train. He was shot at by a guard. He rolled into a ditch and played dead. Because he jumped off the train, his two brothers also jumped off the train. But he had such guilt about it. He said to me when he told me, if I had known that they would do that, I would never have jumped. And I said, Daddy, they were killed instantly. They didn't have to suffer. They didn't have to go through anything else. And if you hadn't lived, you know, he went on to have 3 more kids, all of whom are Jewish, all of whom have raised really lovely human beings. And, you know, we're into the 4th generation now.
All I remember is that we were told, and I just followed what my parents did, that we had to line up again near the platform where the trains, those freight trains were coming in, and we lined up over there with my mother holding her bundle, and we were all packed into these empty freight cars. They packed in close to about 90 people in these freight cars. And people who were standing up couldn't sit down, and people who were sitting down maybe couldn't stand up. The whole family were together in the same freight car. They told us that not to worry, that they are being transported to some Hungarian farms to do some work in these farms, that the families will be kept together. But of course, as the train started moving, I don't remember whether it was exactly 2 days or 3 days or a day and a half. I see the train is slowing down, not passing by a station, but we are arriving at a gate where it says, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. And as we are arriving, and I see a lot of bundles sitting on that platform, and a lot of suitcases sitting on that platform, the doors were opened, and the command was given immediately, aussteigen, everybody disembark. And it was my mother who opened up her bundle, called me over and started putting different pieces of clothing on myself. So whatever you will have on your person, maybe you'll be able to keep. While she was doing this young man passed by and he got very angry. And he said to my mother, why are you doing this? And he will not be needing all this clothing. And then he looks at me and he says, Jingele, wie alt bist du? He says, a little boy, how old are you? And I tell him, I am 14, I'm 14 years old. You are not 14, you're 18. And being like the rebellious boy that I always was, I started arguing with him. And I says, if I am 14, why should I be 18? And then he looks at me and making a point, he puts my finger on my chest. He says, Jingele, Jingele means little boy. If I tell you you're 18, you're 18, now get off. This is the last time I saw my mother. I did not see my mother again after that. And me and my father together went off, and we joined the men's side because they separated the men from the women folks. And my father was asked, kannst du arbeiten? Can you work? And he affirmed that he can work, and he motioned them go this way, which was to the left. I came next, and again the same questions. The minute he asked me how old I am, and I said 18, I'm 18, and he says, kannst du arbeiten? And I said, jawohl. And he motioned to me to go in the same direction as he said my father. If I would have told him 14, I wouldn't be here. The time that we spent in Auschwitz, we were still not assigned to do any work. I was in Auschwitz no more than maybe 2 weeks. They just loaded us up in Auschwitz, again in freight cars. 2 days or 2.5 days or 3 days, we arrived in Mauthausen, the most terrible place where they just killed prisoners without any rhyme or reason. I got to Mauthausen, the number of 68818, which I always had to have on my striped uniform. I was told, a little boy, this is going to be your name from now on. They lined us up one time, and I was not in the same row with my father. My father was about 5 or 6 rows in front of me, and suddenly a German officer came and put about two rows in front of me, put his hand in the middle and says, "Abtreten," and they marched away. My father was in that particular group, and I never saw him again. After I was separated from my father, they assigned us to a third concentration camp. It was called Melk. It was in Austria. Prisoners were drilling into the mountain, in a mountain area, in drilling and constructing tunnels. Mr. Weber was a friend of ours from home. He was a merchant in home. But nevertheless, he worked at the end of the tunnel, and one day he meets me at the exit of the tunnel where I was carrying my pointers, and he says to me, "Srulek, can you come with me?" And I says, "Weber, where are you going? You must have found some food that you want to share with me, right?" And he says, "We'll get there very soon." And we crawled. It was a very hot day. And finally, he pointed to a broken down steel cart. Sure enough, I crawled in there, and I didn't know why. And I look up and I see a whole bunch of twigs and leaves and on the roof of that broken down steel cart. And I say, "Weber, you know, this looks like a sukkah." And he turns to me and says, "Rulek, it does not look like a sukkah. This is a sukkah. And I want to share it with you." And I burst out crying. And I says, "Weber, when we made a bruch al yeshe besukkah, I know what we had. We had herring and fish and all these kugels and all these wonderful cookies and cakes that my mother made. We have nothing here." And he says, "Yeah, but we will have the mitzvah of making the bruch al yeshe besukkah." Ani mamin, ani mamin, ani mamin.
As this part of the process comes to an end, we'd like to take a little bit of time to focus on a topic that we do discuss a lot in class, and that is the concept called theodicy. When a person says, "I have faith in God," what does that mean?
To have trust in Hashem.
That we believe that there's a higher power looking out for us.
That you believe and listen to God.
Okay, so those are excellent answers. And those are very meaningful, that there's trust, and even if I don't understand it, I believe that God has a plan. Think about how one could have lived through the Shoah, and what could that have done to their emunah?
It could affect one's emunah because they might not believe in Hashem as much because all this bad stuff's happening.
They might have gotten very angry and very, very upset, and perhaps not even believed in God.
They could have questioned why Hashem would let this happen.
Is questioning the same thing as Gabe's answer as not believing? Is there a difference between questioning and not believing?
Yeah.
Very good, okay.
I think there's two different ways. It could either weaken it or even strengthen it. They strengthen it because they got through the Holocaust and Hashem helped them go through it. Even though Hashem let it happen, He helped them survive.
Someone who's living through the Shoah, to question it, it's kind of it can bring up the question of why? Why did this happen?
Right.
Why is this happening to me? Why is it happening to my community and my nation? But I think when it brings up questions like that, you think a lot more about it and deeper, and you can really strengthen your connection with Hashem.
Those people like Gabe's answer that are going to completely reject God and be angry at God and be upset at God, we cannot even begin to question their understanding. What they went through is unimaginable, as you've learned. And if somebody reacted in that way, that is how they reacted, and is not in any way our ability to judge them. Emunah is something that we grow with. Emunah means that I have faith in God, that I trust Him, that even when things in my life are not going to go well, I understand that there is a plan, as we learned in these stories. Emunah means letting go to God. We have to take appreciation for what we have today. The ability to come to learn Torah in a day of school every day. The ability to do mitzvos freely and openly. And hopefully this helps us, strengthens us.
We finally came to a city called Kiel. And by this time, now they announced that the war is over, and it is May the 5th of May the 2nd of 1945. The war is over. So we can't say, here, come on, let us out. But we couldn't. You see, we were still the prisoners. Now came Jewish people living in freedom. They started to bring to us food. Some people, they were so hungry, they ate everything, and the system could not tolerate it. So some of them got very sick, and some of them even died from overeating. Now I was reunited with Eva again. And when Eva saw me first, my face was black. And she happened to have a small rag, a washcloth, and she threw that over to me because it was wet for me to wipe my face, so at least she could recognize me as a person and as her brother again.
We stayed until right after we were liberated, which was in probably autumn of 1944. And in the distance, I saw somebody walking the middle of the road. And as he got closer, I saw that he was an American soldier. I ran up to him, threw my arms around his neck, and I kissed him. It's the first time I tasted a piece of chocolate. It's the first time I was given a piece of banana. It was wonderful. It was euphoric to eat this wonderful food that I hadn't tasted before. That's what the liberation meant to us. We knew that finally we were liberated.
I was totally unaware that the war ended, but that had to be shortly before my dad came, and he actually had to kidnap me away from the Ostrowskis. The Ostrowskis did not react well. They yelled, they cried, they did not want to give me up. I was in bed, and I heard this really loud pounding on the door. And this big, tall man in some kind of uniform hat with a visor came into my bedroom, just grabbed me out of bed, wrapping me in my blanket, and running out the door. And outside was a truck, and it was the man who I recognized, but did not yet know what his connection to me was. But I became much less fearful. We drove a very short distance. The car stopped, and he got out of the car, and a few minutes later he brought another child, another little girl. All I knew about her was she was my age. She was another Jewish child that had been hidden by a Catholic family. They took us, it was a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, they took us again, and all I can tell you is I was taken to a kibbutz, and I was left there under the care of a woman that, my dad knew, and he took off with the other child and the guy who was driving. He would come to visit me periodically, but what was happening in the bigger world is he was trying to find survivors. He was trying to find survivors, his nephews, his nieces, his cousins, his parents, his aunts and uncles and grandparents. Nobody survived. I believe I was left on that farm for about 6 months. And after 6 months, he came back and got me and took me with him. I don't remember ever being told I was Jewish. He said, "I'm your uncle, and you're my niece. You're a little Jewish girl. You're not a Catholic girl." I screamed at him, no, I'm not a dirty Jew. I'm a nice little Catholic girl." I can't even imagine how horrible those words were for him to hear.
Everybody knew that the end of the war is approaching already in the beginning of 1945. These Nazis still would not want any of these camps, concentration camps, to be liberated by the Russians from the East and the Americans and the English. As they also took milk and emptied it out and divided many of the prisoners were marched to Ebensee. They did not put us to work in Ebensee, but we also didn't get any of the rations of the little piece of so-called bread or anything. One morning I look out from my barrack and I see that the guard tower is not anymore occupied by a German soldier with a machine gun. Civilians took over the guarding towers, and we were standing at the gate of our camp, and I said to my friends, I think we are being liberated. Fortunately, we were skin and bones, but we were still able to stand up. And finally, we were able, fortunately, to witness the arrival of the American forces when they approached us with their tanks and a few jeeps with soldiers in it. And they explained to us that they are going to have a military-filled kitchen coming into camp, rice with bacon, terrible food. And some prisoners started gobbling it up, and they finally just dropped dead. And I said, let's wait and see what happens. So little by little, we started getting back to a little bit of strength and a little energy. We finally started now to realize that this is the end. What is going to happen to us? Where is my father? Where's my mother? Where is my brother and sister? We started taking inventory of the terrible tragedy that happened. Because before that, everybody was busy only with one thing. How am I survive another day or even another hour?
It felt like really everything had come to life because I had read about his whole life and his whole story on a piece of paper, and we had read all the facts and we had seen where he had been and what he had done, and then we sat down and we heard him talk about it, and the whole story that we had learned already and had already heard about, the whole story just kind of came to life after hearing him tell his own experience.
It was very powerful to hear his words and how and what he did to survive the Holocaust, and that was the most meaningful to me because I didn't ever think I was going to be able to interview a survivor.
I interviewed Martin Lowenberg. I've known him for a very long time, and I have such a special connection with him. And so when I heard that I can interview him, I was so excited because for me to know someone and get to show everyone what kind of person he is and how important he is truly it was such a special opportunity, and I feel like this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and one of the best experiences that I've had in my life.
I'll never know what she went through, but I could kind of feel it a little more than just sitting in class and saying, oh yeah, 6 million people died and they went to this camp and this happened to them. It's a little more when you have details and you actually know this person went here and this is what happened to them.
It was something that I've never done before, and I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to do something like this ever again. So I feel like this is going to be something very powerful for me. It's going to stay with me for a long time.
My mother's sister lived in New York. When we realized that we weren't going to be reunited with my parents, they had me come to New York. And I came here in April of 1945. I know my dad died in the ghetto. My mom and my sister were taken to a concentration camp. I don't know the exact date of that.
We arrived in New York on December 15, 1949. I stood on the deck of the Queen Mary and saw the Statue of Liberty, but I felt as if there were fanfare, patriotic music. I felt such a sense of relief. I felt like this was the end of discrimination for me. We left New York, came to Chicago, and arrived here on December 18, 1949, my 11th birthday.
My siblings made arrangements for us to come to Palestine, and then eventually we came here to the United States. But of course, the ones that I lost were my parents in Auschwitz, and the twins were also killed in Auschwitz.
I arrived to Chicago when I was at the age of 17, and I built my life here since I arrived here in Chicago in the year of 1948. So you know exactly how long I have been here in this city.
We came in February of '47. He had two first cousins living in Cleveland, Ohio, and one of them was in a position to sponsor us. The whole Jewish population of Cleveland was so excited. Akiva Pitluck lived through the war, and he managed to save his niece, Shulamit, and they're coming to Cleveland.
What message would you like to give to all the future generations?
Try to make sure that we defend ourselves the best way we can, and that we really appreciate what we have. And should be so very thankful that we have the state of Israel and that we have people that are still taking care of our religion.
Understand what happened and what's happening so that you can learn from that and prepare for the future.
And I'm sure your children are definitely hopefully have learned a lot of this, how to live together, how to be a good Jew, and how to be an observant Jew.
My message that I take away from this is that we need to live life to the fullest, and we need to understand and be grateful for the little things that we have, because we never know how easy it could be taken away from us.
You represent future generations that are going to come into this world, and I want you to remember, Zechoyer, remember Mash Usul Chabolek, what they did to us during Horm Europe, and don't forget and tell this to your children.
My message is to always remember what happened and to always look out for each other and speak up.
So I think it's important to educate people, because ignorance is the very worst thing that can happen to young people. Ignorance breeds prejudice, it breeds bigotry.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
So much.
It was nice to meet all of you.
Don't let this ever happen again, and stand up for anyone who is being bullied or who's not being treated right.
Out of this interview, I take that the kindness of the town, the kindness of her uncle, the kindness of the couple that took her in was what kept her alive, and I understand that. Kindness is very important, and I hope that I can be more kind in my life.
One message I would give to my generation is to stop hating one another. Hate is what led to the Holocaust, and that is what led to over 11 million deaths. And if we can learn to love one another more, then I think the world would be a lot more peaceful and a better place.
What is your message to our generation?
An act of kindness goes a long way. Wrong is always wrong, even if everyone is doing it. And you just don't know how one little thing that you may say or do is going to impact on someone's life. Kindness. Kindness above everything.